freshman year is my club instructor. And throughout my time at Ambassador College, I believe I was only ever called in one time by this gentleman. My dress attire was a little bit weak at the time. And one of the I was told to, if I remember correctly, get a haircut and maybe think about buying a few more white shirts. But a very good friend of mine, who I'm very privileged to introduce to you today, Dr. Ralph Levy, for the sermon.
Well, in spite of that abusive treatment, Mr. Gus is still here. So I'm very pleased to see that. And he's also, I congratulate him. That haircut looks very good. White shirt. You pass. Good afternoon. Very happy Sabbath to all of you. I should begin by commenting on my voice. This is not a ploy to hold everyone's attention. This week I seem to have gotten a little bit of a virus somehow. I don't know how I got it. I don't suffer too much with the allergies as many of you do, but I picked up a virus somewhere along the line, and it sort of afflicted my throat. And yesterday in class, students had to sit through 2 hours, and I think I sounded a little bit worse yesterday. It feels a little bit better today. So anyway, I called Mr. Burnett and said, yes, I hope to go ahead and speak. So sorry, I hope it doesn't distract too terribly much. I'm not putting it on. I guess style doesn't substitute for substance when you give a sermon, but it is for real. But nothing major, and hoping to get over it in the next day or two. I think you've had most of the news. I think the church gets a lot of the news these days. We have 4 more days of class at Foundation Institute for this year before we take our break. Thursday classes finish. Both students and faculty. I won't speak for Mr. Johnson, but I know at least one faculty member who's pretty tired. Maybe Mr. Johnson is not, but I am, and the students, I think, are looking forward to the break as well. So we break on Thursday to give us sufficient time for Passover and unleavened bread. Lots of travels going on in the office. Please keep that in your prayers. Mr. Franks is now in Fiji, I believe. He left on Wednesday, and I think he moves on to New Zealand in the next day or two. I don't recall the details about all of his travel schedule. Mr. Joel Meeker, I know, would appreciate your prayers. He's got a very long trip, 5-week long trip to mostly Francophone Africa. And I asked him the other day, I said, well, most of the brethren are concentrated in Africa. We don't have a large number of French-speaking brethren in Europe. And of course, when you travel to some of the African countries, it can be quite challenging. I was asking him about how he does the travel plans, and he described some of his schedule to me. So that's a very, very busy trip he's got coming up. So please keep him in your prayers. And I think just about all of us, the ministry who work in the office, are going different places. We've got a sort of an office diaspora, and I don't recall where everyone is going, but everyone's going all over the place. I will be leaving on Friday for the Dominican Republic. I haven't been there in, I think, a year, and we have a very small group there. We're going to have a little Passover service there a week from tomorrow night, and then we'll have the night to be observed, and then we'll have the first holy day, and I'm going to come back after the first holy day. I'm back here for 2 or 3 days, and then leaving for Mexico City. Lots of travel. I've not been in Mexico City for a very, very long time, and I'm looking forward to the last holy day in Mexico City. Also looking forward to that Dominican Republic trip. There are 2 ladies there who are, I think we would describe them as prospective members of the church, and they were in Guatemala for the feast this past year. So I'm looking forward to the chance to sit down with them and see, where things are, how seriously interested they may be in the church. I'm curious to see what's taken place. So please keep everyone traveling in your prayers, and of course the upcoming Passover service and the days of unleavened bread, beginning, of course, a Sunday night with the Passover next weekend. There are not many places in the Bible where we find an animal speaking. In fact, I can only think of 2 places. The first one, of course, was the Garden of Eden with the serpent. The second one occurs in the book of Numbers. A donkey talked. There is a lesson in the speech of the donkey that I'd like to address with you this afternoon, because it actually has something to say to us. A donkey can teach us something, teaches all of us something. There was a lesson in that donkey speaking for a man who was on the scene at the time. I believe this lesson also relates to the Passover season, and to the fact that we're all getting ready for our recommitment to serving God and Jesus Christ as our Savior. So the introduction to the sermon is going to be a little bit lengthy, but please bear with me. I will get there, okay? We're going to talk a little bit about a very interesting personage out of the Old Testament, and what I think is really a very big lesson for all of us in God's church in the year 2014. Let's begin not in the Old Testament, but let's turn to the book of Revelation chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2. And while you're turning there, I'm going to get one of the water bottles and take a little sip of water. Revelation chapter 2, and I want to just pick up one verse, verse 14. This is the message to Pergamos, the third of the 7 churches. And there's an interesting comment stuck right in the middle of the context of this message to the church in Pergamos. Revelation 2, verse 14. Jesus Christ, speaking to the angel of the church in Pergamos, says, "But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." It's an interesting comment, isn't it? There was a problem in the church in Pergamos, and it reflected a problem that had taken place originally in the Old Testament, involving a man by the name of Balaam. Jesus Christ here in this verse points to the matter of eating things offered to idols. It's an interesting thing. We don't have the time to digress and go through it all, but I think you probably know that in some places the Apostle Paul told the church that eating meat that had been offered to idols was no big deal in itself. And in another context, he told them to avoid it. Now, there's a story there, of course. Mr. Johnson, I know, has spoken about this in the classes, in his sermons. There's a big story, and it actually will bear on what I'd like to discuss this afternoon. Eating things offered to idols, and it also mentions sexual immorality. Balaam was a very interesting individual. I did a little bit of research on this person and discovered that there's more extra-biblical information about him than I had expected. He's actually mentioned in the Talmud. I found this on aish.com. The Talmud, Sanhedrin 106a, tells us that earlier Balaam had been an advisor to the Pharaoh, who enslaved the children of Israel and sought to destroy their male children. In fact, the plan to destroy the Israelites was masterminded by Balaam. The 3rd century BCE Greco-Egyptian historian Manetho also mentions that it was the prophet advisor to the Pharaoh who instigated the enslavement of the Jewish people, and then a reference to Josephus, Contra Appium 1:26. That's a sort of for what it's worth thing. But I thought it was interesting that some Jewish sources say that Balaam was even around at the time of the Exodus. Perhaps a little bit more interestingly, there's been an interesting archaeological find took place in the 20th century, about 1967, actually in the nation of Jordan. And archaeologists went digging around as they do, and they found an ancient inscription that apparently refers to this Balaam. It's referred to as the Deir Allah inscription, or the Balaam son of Beor inscription, discovered during a 1967 excavation in Deir Allah, Jordan. The excavation revealed a many-chambered structure that had been destroyed by earthquake during the Persian period at the site, on the wall of which was written a story relating visions of the seer of the gods, Balaam, son of Beor, who may be the same Balaam mentioned in Numbers chapters 22 to 24 and in other passages of the Bible. This Balaam differs from the one in Numbers in that rather than being a prophet of Yahweh, he is associated with Ashtar, a god named, and I don't know how this is pronounced, S-H-G-R, Shagur, and Shaddai gods and goddesses. It also features the word Elohim, taken to mean gods, small g, S on the end, in the plural, rather than the Hebrew deity. That's from the Wikipedia article on Deir Allah. I would say, just interject here, that I think that probably was the same individual. I'm going to read you a little bit of this inscription later on. From another source, theosophicalwordpress.com. Quote, "There was no extra-biblical record of a prophet by this name. But in 1967, Dutch archaeologists excavating in Deir Allah, Jordan, uncovered one. They found 119 fragments of plaster with ink writing carbon dated to approximately 800 BC, parentheses the time of Ahab. The language is a mix between Aramaic and Canaanite. The presence of archaic words indicates it is based on an older text. Now, I'll just mention in passing, I think that was the same individual because, you might want to take a look at it. It's interesting. Get on your computer if you'd like, and we'll read a little bit of it shortly in the course of the sermon. But this Deir Allah inscription actually does match fairly well what the Bible tells us about this particular individual by the name of Balaam. But who was Balaam? Who was he? And what does all of this have to say to us as Christians, members of God's church, in the year 2014? After all, this is 35 centuries later. 35 centuries or more, a little bit more than that. I'd like to go back to the scene in the book of Numbers and get a little bit of the backdrop before we actually look at what Balaam did and what it means for us. The scene in the book of Numbers, I was going over it again this morning. It's very interesting. You can read over the general thrust of it, but in the book of Numbers, prior to getting to Numbers 22, which is where Balaam is introduced, you see this great victorious army. They're coming through. And, well, they're not really an army, are they? They're really a great population. Men, women, children, elderly, little ones, and no one can stop them. No one can stop them. There are lots of little kingdoms on the eastern side of the Jordan. And, I looked over it again this morning. It just struck me. Some of those kingdoms must have been absolutely terrified, just terrified, because they'd heard. And one of the interesting things in the Bible is that in the ancient Near East, these things have their echoes. So I'm sure that nations like Edom and Moab and some of the others knew about the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They knew what had taken place. There was no stopping them. And I'm sure they knew about the plagues on Egypt. I'm sure they knew that the God of this particular nation seemed to be very, very powerful. And they were frightened. This God of this nation, Israel, had sort of mocked the Egyptian gods. And after all, Egypt was the great kingdom at the time, up to the point that the mockery made a really foolishness of the great Egyptian god, the sun god Ra or Re, because I'm sure they'd heard it all went dark at one point during the plagues. Lots of little kingdoms on the eastern side of the Jordan, and in Numbers 20, which we're not going to read, but I'll just allude to, you've got Edom, one of those Transjordanian nations, and Moses says, "Can we come through?" And the Edomites say, "No." And Moses says again, "Can we come through?" And the Edomites, in a very gruff manner, say, "No." And in a very hostile manner, refuse them passage. In Numbers chapter 21, something very similar. Sihon, king of the Amorites, again, the request to pass through. And in this case, the refusal, and the Israelites come out against them. And then, at the end of Numbers chapter 21, I love this guy's name. In the end, look at his name in your Bible, Numbers 21. There's a whole succession of these kingdoms here. Edom, Sihon, various different others. And I love this man's name, King Og. Isn't that a wonderful name? If you have a son, call him Bill or George, anything but Og. King Og, he was a big dude, he was. And he couldn't stop them either. He was the king of Bashan. Bashan is up roughly where the Golan Heights are today, in that extreme northeastern sector, and he couldn't stop them. And there's a little detail before we get into the material about Balaam. Keep your place here in the book of Numbers. Let's turn forward to Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. Deuteronomy 3 and verse 11, where we're given a detail about this man Og. How many times can I weave the name Og into one sermon? And I have to move on. Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. Indeed, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. Big deal. Well, of course, the Israelites didn't have iron at that point, so it's actually making a comment about the fact that he was a good bit more advanced technologically than was Israel. And then it comments on the size of his bedstead. 9 cubits its length, about 13 and a half feet long, and 4 cubits its width, according to the standard cubit. I don't know how many people in the Bible have the size of their bed expressed for all posterity. But this guy, his bed was 13 and a half feet long and 6 feet wide, much bigger than a California king. And he couldn't stop them either. There is no stopping these people. It's impossible. And I'm sure everyone was terrified. They were absolutely terrified. How do we stop them? Military undertakings don't work. It doesn't work. You can't stop them. It's a bunch of, they don't look like an army, women and children and kids, but we can't stop them. Even spiritual things, don't seem to work because it seems as if their God is very, very powerful. And there's no way to prevent him from doing what he set out to do. I'm sure there's a lesson there for us at this time of the year as well. Very, very big lesson. It was, of course, God's purpose to bring them into the land. And then we come across a man by the name of Balak. Don't get them confused. Balak with a K is the king of Moab. Moab was in the Transjordanian side, on the eastern side, roughly where the nation of Jordan is today. You remember that both Moab and Ammon resulted from the incident with Lot in the cave with his daughters back in Genesis chapter 19, following the Sodom and Gomorrah destruction. And Balak wants desperately to stop them. How can I stop them? We find him in an alliance with another nation by the name of Midian, roughly where Saudi Arabia would be in the modern world. So let's pick it up in Numbers chapter 22, and I want to read part of this and move through, because here is where this individual Balak begins to figure. Balaam begins to figure. Balak, I must get myself mixed up here. Balak, king of Moab, hires Balaam. And Balaam turns out to be a kind of a prophet for hire. He'll do anything to make a buck. Some of you may remember the story in Herbert W. Armstrong's autobiography. There was a wonderful story there about how many, many years ago a man approached him and said, I want to work for you. And Mr. Armstrong said, well, you have to understand what I teach. You have to understand the doctrines. And the response of the man at that time, you may remember it was, well, it doesn't make any difference. I don't care what doctrines you have. I just want to be a preacher. So Balaam was a little bit like that. He was a prophet for hire. And it's interesting that we do have this record of him from outside of the Bible. And anyway, let's pick it up in Numbers chapter 22, and I'd like to read a little bit of this. It gets very, very interesting. There are things embedded in the Balaam story that give us a very important message and something that we need to learn and to reinforce, I think, from time to time as members of the church. Numbers 22, verse 1, the children of Israel moved and camped in the plains of Moab on this side of the Jordan across from Jericho. This side of the Jordan is the eastern side. Now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites in the previous chapter, and he's terrified. Stop him. But I can't. And then suddenly an idea enters his head. Maybe, I've heard of a guy who lives a long way away, and people say he's a diviner, he's a prophet, he's a soothsayer endowed with certain abilities. Verse 3, Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people because they were many. Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. Got a little ahead of myself here, because Balaam isn't mentioned for another verse or two. Moab said to the elders of Midian, they're in an alliance, now this company will lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. A wonderful little piece of hyperbole, but it indicates how they were feeling about this. They're just going to lick up everything. There'll be nothing left behind. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at the time. There he is in verse 5. Here's Balaam mentioned for the first time. He sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor near the river. When it mentions the river in the Old Testament, it's one of two rivers. It's either the Nile or the Euphrates. And your Bible probably has a footnote, as mine does, in verse 5. This was the Euphrates. So a message goes way over to where modern Iraq is. He needs some help. He calls on this diviner over by the Euphrates. in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Look, a people has come from Egypt. They cover the face of the earth. There were lots of them. Book of Exodus says there were 600,000 men of fighting age. We translate that into maybe 2.5, maybe even 3 million total population moving through to enter the promised land. Verse 6, therefore please come at once, curse this people for me. They are too mighty for me. Balak's idea is, I can't stop them militarily, but maybe this guy who lives over in Iraq, and he's got a reputation, and maybe I can get him to come in, and maybe he can do something to stop them using divining, using his powers as a prophet for hire. Verse 6, perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for, excuse me, sorry, getting a little dry in the throat. Water is the best drink. Balak says, though I'm sure he didn't have a dry throat when he said it, he says, and I'm going to have a little bit more water and I will get back beyond this. I'm not getting emotional here. It's just that my throat is drying out. Okay. He says, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. It's very interesting there in verse 6. And again, it ties in with that extra-biblical inscription. Balaam had a reputation. Balaam's reputation was as a fairly effective individual, a diviner, a prophet. And now what I'd like to do is just pause at that point and to read you a little bit from this Deir Allah inscription. It reads as follows, and I do believe, by the way, it was one and the same individual. Scholars talk about, well, the timing isn't quite right. Well, the inscription seems to be a little bit later than these 15th century events, but it's quite possible the inscription dates from after that. Here's what some of this says, this extra-biblical inscription. The misfortunes of the book of Balaam, son of Beor, a divine seer was he. The gods came to him at night, and he beheld a vision in accordance with El's utterance. They said to Balaam, son of Beor, so will it be done with naught surviving. No one has seen the likes of what you have heard. Balaam arose on the morrow. He summoned the heads of the assembly to him, and for 2 days he fasted and wept bitterly. Then his intimates entered into his presence, and they said to Balaam, son of Beor, why do you fast, and why do you weep? He said to them, be seated. I will relate to you what the Shaddai gods have planned. And go, see the acts of the god, small g. The gods have banded together. The Shaddai gods have established a council, and they've said to the goddess Shagar, sow up, close up the heavens with dense cloud, that darkness exist here, not brilliance, obscurity and not clarity, so that you instill dread in dense darkness, and never utter a sound again. Well, whatever the case is, it does seem that Balaam was very, very famous in the ancient Near East. Balak knew what he was doing, and he tries to hire him. He is a non-Israelite prophet for hire. Now, what follows here is something I think we all understand. We understand this from the book of Job, because we know that God is in overall control of the spirit world. And Balak hires Balaam to curse the people. We'll see them jumping from mountaintop to mountaintop. And Balaam does not curse them. And you know from the introduction from the book of Job, we understand that God told Satan the devil, thus far and no farther. And the thing we're seeing here is something very similar. Thus far and no farther. So let's keep on reading. We're in Numbers 22, verse 7. So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the diviner's fee in their hand, a little bit of money, a little bribe for him. And they came to Balaam and spoke to him the words of Balak. And he said to them, lodge here tonight, and I will bring back word to you as the Lord speaks to me. Look at that in verse 8. The Lord, capital letters, that's the covenantal name, the YHVH of the God, the true God, the God of the Hebrews back then, of course. And it's interesting how Balaam refers to him. So the princes of Moab stayed with Balaam. God came to Balaam, verse 9, and said, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God, "Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Look, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth. Come, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to overpower them and drive them out." God said to Balaam, verse 12, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." As we noted, God is in supreme power. He tells Balaam, no, you can't. You're not allowed to. And guess what? Balaam doesn't go, because God is in control here. But there's a little more. We have to dig a little bit deeper. Verse 13. So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, "Go back to your land, for the Eternal has refused to give me permission to go with you." The princes of Moab rose and went back to Balak and said, "Balaam refused to come with us." Balak is really going to get mad as we go through all of this. He's not a happy camper. He wants so much to stop them. Verse 15. Balak again sent princes more numerous and more honorable than they. He comes up in rank to kind of flatter him, make his ego feel good. More prominent individuals. They came to Balaam and they said to him, "Thus says Balak, the son of Zippor, please let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I will certainly honor you greatly." Now, that, I looked at it a couple of times and wondered if it was a reference to name and fame or money. Actually, the context is clearly about money. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of bucks or euros or whatever the case, shekels, whatever the case would have been. "I'll certainly honor you greatly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Therefore, please come and curse this people for me. I want to stop them. Come on, I'll make you a wealthy man." Verse 18. Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, "Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Eternal my God to do less or more. Now, therefore, please, you stay here tonight that I may know what more the Eternal will say to me." And God came to Balaam at night, and he said to him, "If the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do." This is a really unusual example in the Bible where God is giving instructions to, and even in a sense speaking through, a false prophet, a prophet for hire. This is not a true prophet of God. And God says, "This far and no farther." Now here's where it gets interesting. Verse 21. Balaam rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and he went with the princes of Moab. God gave him permission to do that, right? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 22. Here's the interesting part. Then God's anger was aroused because he went. Wait a second. I thought we read in verse 20, "Yes, you may go with them." You can go with them. "If they men come to you, go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do." We'll see in the remainder of these Balaam events that we're going to kind of move through a little faster, that he does prophesy blessings on Israel. He goes with them, and God's mad at him. Why? Is God that capricious? Or is there something else going on here? Verse 22 again. Then God's anger was aroused because he went. And the angel of the Eternal took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. He was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. And then this very famous scene with Balaam and the donkey. Balaam has done what God said he was free to do, and God got angry with him. And then poor old Balaam with the foot crushed against the wall. You remember verses 23 through 34, and I think I won't read all the way through it, but I think we know about this story where Balaam is riding his donkey, and the angel of God is there, and the donkey won't move. And the interesting thing, of course, is that the donkey sees the angel of God, and Balaam doesn't. And as a result, he gets his foot crushed against the wall. And he begins to beat his donkey. And his donkey turns to him. And he says, "I've been good to you all this long time." We heard about compassion in the sermonette. Maybe the donkey was more compassionate than Balaam. But certainly, I think what we're intended to understand from this wonderful event that took place here, the story preserved in the scriptures, is that the donkey is more sensitive to the hand of God than Balaam. Verse 34, Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned. I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now, therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back. That's not the verse I want. There's verse 32 is the verse I want. That's what I want. Verse 32. I'm trying to paraphrase this. Verse 32, there's another little detail here in the midst of this story. And the angel of the Eternal said to him, to Balaam, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I've come out to stand against you, because your way is perverse before me. What had he done? Well, the donkey perceived the angel of the Lord more than he did, but Balaam had to have his eyes opened. Balaam's way was perverse. Balaam's way was perverse before God. Why? Verse 33. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I should have killed you by now and let her live. Verse 34, Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I've sinned. I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back. Your way is perverse before me. And in verses 35 through the end of the chapter, Balaam goes with Balak. He turns back. And then beginning in verse 23, chapter 23, we're going to get a series of prophecies. Balaam and Balak are together. Balaam is under God's control. Balak wants very much to persuade Balaam to curse Israel. And you'll notice something rather interesting if you want to go over this entire section. It's very interesting. But they're sort of hopping from mountaintop to mountaintop because the pagans believed that gods had localized influence. So they go to the top of the first mountain, and in chapter 23, verse 7, there's the oracle of Balak. You actually get 4 prophecies here. 23, verse 7, he, Balaam, took up his oracle and said, Balak, the king of Moab, has brought me from Aram, from the mountains of the east, way over where the Iraq is today. Come, curse Jacob for me, and come, denounce Israel. Verse 8, how shall I curse whom God has not cursed? How shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? From the top of the rocks I see him. From the hills I behold him, that is Israel. There a people dwelling alone, not reckoning itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number 1/4 of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his. He's gone over on the wrong side. Balak was willing to pay him lots and lots of money to curse his enemies. And Balak's reaction, verse 11, what have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, and look, you've blessed them bountifully. Verse 12, he answered and he said, must I not take heed to speak what the Eternal has put in my mouth? The first prophecy, and there's a series of them. I'm not going to read the second and the third. You're welcome to read that yourselves if you'd like to later on. But the second and the third prophecies are very, very interesting. Verses 25 and 26. After the second prophecy, Balak says to Balaam, can't you even go neutral? He keeps on blessing Israel. Neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all. Balaam answered and said to Balak, didn't I tell you? All that the Eternal speaks, that I must do. So we go through this entire drama with 4 oracles uttered by Balaam. And each time Balak is trying to tell him, curse him. And Balaam doesn't do it. In fact, he does exactly the opposite. He utters a blessing over them. And we finally get to the 4th prophecy, oracle number 4 in Numbers chapter 24. Maybe the most dramatic, and Balak must have been mad as a hornet here, because not only does Balaam prophesy of the Messiah, but he also prophesies that Balak's own people are going to be beaten down by this Messiah to come. The 4th prophecy, Numbers 24, verse 15. So he took up his oracle and he said, the utterance of Balaam, the son of Beor, the utterance of the man whose eyes are opened, the utterance of him who hears the words of God and who has knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. And then verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. Verse 17 is interesting. That prophecy, of course, carries all the way down to New Testament times. When the wise men heard about the birth of the Messiah, they say, we've seen his star. And it's a reflection of this prophecy out of the mouth of a pagan prophet in Numbers chapter 23. But look at what he goes on to say. Verse 18, Edom shall be a possession, Seir also his enemies shall be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. This is talking about what Messiah will do. Verse 17, a scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter the brow of Moab and destroy all the sons of tumult. Remember, it was the king of Moab who was trying to hire him in the first place. So Balak is very, very upset because this prophecy is against his own people. And he prophesies against Amalek in verse 20, and he prophesies against the Kenites in verse 21, and in verse 25 at the end of the chapter, Balaam rose and departed and returned to his place, and Balak went his way, very upset. Offered him lots of money, didn't do what I wanted him to do. All right, so far, so good, apparently. But then at this point, something goes very, very wrong. And I think you know a little of what happens here. We understand Numbers chapter 25 is not disconnected from Numbers chapter 24. Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3. Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, that staging point on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. Whoa, where did this come from? Balaam's gone home. And all of a sudden, we get this outbreak of immorality tied together with paganism. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Eternal was aroused against Israel. And you know what? This is such a key event in the history of Israel, that this problem of idolatry that's introduced here is not completely uprooted until they go into Babylonian captivity centuries later. Something has gone badly wrong. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What's happened here? They couldn't be destroyed militarily. Balak's attempts to force Balaam to curse them from the spirit realm have failed miserably. And then suddenly, they're being corrupted from the inside. Numbers chapter 31, verse 16. Numbers chapter 31 and verse 16. Numbers 31 and verse 16. This is the war against the Midianites, Numbers 31 verse 16. And Moses is mad at the Israelites because they have not carried out God's commandment to put these people to death. Numbers 31 verse 15, Moses said to them, have you kept all the women alive? Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Eternal in the incident of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. Balaam did it. He got at them from the inside. He engineered it. You see, God didn't tell him explicitly not to bring about this seduction of Israel from the inside. He told him, you can't curse them. He told him that more than once. And he didn't. But then we see he did do something that he wasn't expressly forbidden to do. Let's go back, and I don't like to repeat scriptures, but I want to just pick up those two verses in Numbers 22, verses 21 and 22 once again, because this begins to give us a little bit of insight into the problem here. Numbers 22, verses 21 and 22. Numbers 22, verse 21. Balaam rose in the morning, he saddled his donkey, and he went with the princes of Moab with God's permission. Verse 22. Then God's anger was aroused because he went, and the angel of the Eternal took his stand in the way. God was mad at him. Are we beginning to get a little bit of an indication of what happened here? Why? What went on inside of Balaam's mind? What's happening? Turn with me to the New Testament, to Jude, the book of Jude, and verse 11. the book of Jude, very short book, of course, just before the book of Revelation. Jude 11, where we begin to get pieces of the puzzle that tie it all together and that contain a lesson for us. I know it's taken a good while to get to it, but I think it's all kind of interesting, but there's a lesson. Jude, verse 11. Jude says, "Woe to them, to the false teachers in his time. They've gone in the way of Cain, and they've run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah." And now 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. 2 Peter chapter 2 in the book of Jude, very similar material. 2 Peter 2, verse 15. And Peter records a little bit more detail for us. 2 Peter 2, verse 15. Talking about some of the apostates in his time. "They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness." Isn't that interesting? He never got his money because God told him, you can't. But he loved the wages of unrighteousness. Verse 16, "He was rebuked for his iniquity. A donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet." Are we beginning to get a clear picture here? And is there a big lesson here? When we put together the Old Testament account with these scattered references in the New Testament, and also with the indication that it was Balaam who engineered this undermining of Israel by luring them into the pagan practices, we're getting the impression of someone who did what he was told to do explicitly by the letter of the law. And yet, as we're told here in Peter, he loved the wages of unrighteousness. Balaam wanted the money. Balaam wanted the money. Balaam couldn't take the money because God wouldn't permit him. Balaam was not really a true convert. God used him, but he works in a kind of a duplicitous kind of a way. Now, okay, here's the transition, and here's the lesson, I think, for us as we approach the spring holiday season. Because, of course, we're all preparing our homes. Probably some of us doing some de-leavening tomorrow, maybe wrapping it up. We've got work to do. We look for physical leavening in our lives, and we put that physical leavening out. Clean out the vacuum cleaner, do all those other things that we have to do. We look for spiritual leavening in terms of our actions, the things that we do. And we try to change where we find we're not in keeping with God's will. But there's something more than that here, and a lesson from Balaam. Balaam, you see, wanted to sin. Why didn't he? Why did he only go up to so far? Because God said this far and no farther. The point being, the lesson that we must learn from Balaam is that we must not want to sin. We must not want to sin. Not only do we put out physical leavening out of our lives, not only do we stop the actions that are against God's will, but even our will, our desire, our wants, and that's where we got to be different from Balaam. We have to eradicate not just the sin, but also the desire to sin. Maybe this is perhaps the biggest part of our pre-Passover preparation. You know, some people will say, well, the New Testament is the part of the Bible that deals with the inner man, the inner woman, and the Old Testament doesn't go that way. You know, Old Testament is about a kind of an external religion, and that's not really true. I'd like for us to take a look at a few scriptures to underline this point. Zechariah, let's go to the book of Zechariah, chapter 7. Zechariah 7. Zechariah 7. There are many, many of the prophets and the writers of the Old Testament who address this point. The desire to do what's wrong. It's possible to do what's right up to a point, as Balaam did, but still retain the desire to do what's wrong. Zechariah 7, verse 10. I love this verse. It kind of jumps out at you. Zechariah is one of those prophets. It's a kind of apocalyptic literature, lots of symbolism. But Zechariah 7, verse 10 contains something rather important here. Zechariah gives instruction to that remnant of Judah after the exile, and it says, "Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. Let none of you plan evil in his heart against his brother." I think there the Old King James Version says, "think evil in his heart." Zechariah 8, verse 17. Zechariah 8, verse 17. See, Balaam was planning it. He was planning a way to get at Israel. And because there wasn't an absolutely explicit command, he went ahead and he did it. Zechariah 8, verse 17. Let none of you think evil in your heart against your neighbor, and do not love a false oath, for all these things I hate. Eradicating the desire to sin. If we've got a weed in our garden, it's much more effective to pluck the whole thing up by the root, isn't it, than to simply take the leaves of that weed and pull them up and let it grow back. The principle is very straightforward. Psalm 19. Psalm 19. Passover preparation involves looking at our desires, our motivational patterns, why we do the things that we do. And, you know, frankly, we've had people in the church who did what they were told to do, but deep down didn't want to. Not a very good recipe for spiritual growth. Psalm 19, verses 12 through 14. Psalm 19, verses 12 through 14. David asks, who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults. One of our prayers, of course, at this time of the year should be, God, show me the things that I need to see, the things that I haven't realized. Those things can happen, can't they? Then verse 13, keep back your servant from presumptuous sins. Presumptuous sins, a little different from secret faults. The phrase actually in the Hebrew is sins committed with a high hand. The images of someone with their fist in the air in defiance against God, saying, you know, I don't care what God thinks. We hopefully don't sin that way. Let them not have dominion over me, then I shall be blameless, and I shall be innocent of great transgression. Verse 14, that the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Isn't that a wonderful verse? I think that's so meaningful, and it should be part of our prayer, I think, not only in the spring, but all the year round, that the words of our mouths, the things we say, and the things in our hearts, our thoughts, our impulses, we de-leaven not just bread, crackers, we de-leaven not just actions that may go against God, but we're to de-leaven our hearts as well and examine our motivations. Of course, when the motivation is right, the rest follows in place. The scriptures tell us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We tend to speak what's on our minds. Ezekiel chapter 11 and verse 19. Ezekiel has a wonderful way of stating all of this. Ezekiel 11 and verse 19. Ezekiel 11 verse 19. Ezekiel doesn't use the term New Covenant. If I students know how many times the words New Covenant are used in the Old Testament, because I pop quizzed them on that more than once. One time out of the writings of Jeremiah only, but Ezekiel refers to the New Covenant. He alludes to it. Ezekiel 11 verse 19. He's talking about the New Covenant. He's talking about the restoration of Israel. And look what he says. Then I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within them, and take the stony heart out of their flesh, and give them a heart of flesh. Ezekiel talks about that most fundamental kind of a change, which is not just words, not just actions, not just getting the bread out and bringing the matzos in, but changing what motivates people. And he says this is going to happen to national Israel at some point in the future. Ezekiel 18, verse 31. Ezekiel 18, verse 31. Ezekiel 18, verse 31. Cast away from you all the transgressions which you've committed, and get yourselves a new heart and a new spirit. For why should you die, O house of Israel? And one more in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 36 and verse 26. Ezekiel 36 and verse 26. God's way of life is a way of life that begins with the heart. Balaam's heart was not there. Balaam wanted the money. Balaam wanted to get at Israel, but he couldn't because God would only let him go so far. We've got to want more than that. We have to want not just to not do what's wrong, but not to think what's wrong. Ezekiel 36 and verse 26. Ezekiel 36, verse 26, Ezekiel says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Verse 27, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them. True obedience to God is, of course, obedience from the heart. And I think many of us have known people who, were around the church and did certain things, and yet when the opportunity came, they threw it all away. What God asks of us, I think, is a little deeper than that. He wants us to not want to do what's wrong. He wants us to want to do what's right. Do we want to sin, or do we want to serve God? We need to examine our desires. We need to examine our motivations. We need to take a close look at why we do some of the things that we do. Matthew 5 and verse 8. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8. Good to move to the New Testament, but I just wanted to demonstrate the fact this is in the Old Testament as well, of course, as it is. Matthew 5 and verse 8. Matthew 5 and verse 8. Jesus Christ, of course, also talked about the heart. Matthew 5, verse 8, Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. A lot of truth in that, isn't there? You get closer to God when your motivation is pure, when the things that you want are the right things. I've heard people over the years, you can probably recall certain people who kept the seventh-day Sabbath according to the commandment for a long length of time, and then when somebody said, you don't have to anymore, they said, oh, I never wanted to do that in the first place. I hated the Sabbath. Anybody ever heard somebody say something like that? We shouldn't chafe against the restrictions. We don't just follow the letter of the law. Well, okay, God, I won't do this, but really I'd like to. No, the way of life that God gives us is a way of life in which we uproot the sin. And we don't commit adultery because we don't want to. We don't work on the Sabbath because we don't want to. We don't bear false witness against a neighbor because we don't want to. We want to do what's right. From time to time, I think we even need to ask God to help us to eradicate the desire to sin, not just the overt actions. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it's before the Passover. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. Let's move to a scripture that's quite familiar at this time of the year. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7. It's interesting, of course, as I think we understand, the church in Corinth was not a predominantly Jewish church. Commentators struggle with this. The Apostle Paul clearly makes reference to the days of unleavened bread here, to a church that was predominantly Greek, not rooted in the Old Covenant community. And he makes reference to the days of unleavened bread. Verse 7, 1 Corinthians 5. Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. I love the way we sang about that in the hymns in the early part of the service this afternoon. Verse 8. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The Apostle Paul is addressing essentially the same question that Zechariah talked about and Ezekiel talked about. Motivation. What's inside? What's going on deep inside of us? That word malice is interesting. The definition of the word malice is a very interesting thing. Hastings Dictionary of the New Testament, online edition. Malice is the propensity to inflict injury upon another or to take pleasure in his misfortunes. In early English, it denoted wickedness in general, but the modern meaning is found in Shakespeare, e.g. in Othello's words. So a quote from Shakespeare now. You didn't expect to hear Shakespeare quoted in the sermon, but I think this it ties in nicely. Speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. That's quoted from Othello. The Greek word here, kakia, changed its connotation in much the same way. In classical Greek, it was not a particular fault or vice, but that badness of nature or character, opposite to arete, virtue, excellence, which is the root of all faults. Cicero discusses the point in one of his writings, and all of this is in Latin, and I won't read the Latin to you. In the New Testament, the context generally indicates that kakia is a specific fault or vice. The compound word, malicious disposition, designates but one of the many elements or workings of the reprobate mind, in a Bible reference to Romans 1, verse 29. Christians recall the time before the washing of regeneration, when they were living in malice, in kakia, and envy, Titus 3, verse 3. Kakia is one of the sins which a believer must resolutely put away. He is not to eat the Christian Passover with the leaven of malice, and the reference to 1 Corinthians 5, verse 8 that we just read. In malice, he is to be a babe. Without apparent cause, the revisers preferred wickedness in James 1, verse 21 and other passages, relegating malice to the margin. Only once is the wider meaning unquestionable. The kakia, of which Simon the magician is urged to repent, is no specific fault, but the deep-seated wickedness of a man who is still in the gall of bitterness, and a reference to Acts chapter 8. Well, I think there's a lesson there, isn't there? We've got the Passover just 1 week away. We talk a lot about it in the spring. Sunday night, we'll take the Passover, then we enter into 7 days of unleavened bread. We de-leaven, we put leaven out of our homes. We look at the way we're living, we examine ourselves, we examine the things that we're doing, examine the words that we utter. But let's also remember over these next few days that what God asks of us, and perhaps part of our self-examination, is the desire to sin. Let's look inside. What motivates us? What makes us do the things that we do? What's going on inside? Balaam failed that test. You and I must not. Let's look at what's inside and make sure that we desire to do what's right in his sight.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. A privilege as always. Brethren, just one reminder that those who have children that are in children's